Hey, today I just wanted to go over a book that I just read called The End of Average by Todd Rose. A lot of times I end up reading a book and then find that I kind of forget a lot of the stuff in it, or sometimes even the fact that I read the book altogether. So I wanted to make this so that I could remember the concepts of the book and maybe help you get some of the same concepts. I definitely recommend reading the entire thing because I obviously can't go over an entire book in like 15 minutes. So I'll leave a link in the description to the book if you'd like to buy it. So he first talks about the United States Air Force having a lot of crashes with their pilots, and they were looking into why are we having so many plane crashes? Is it something mechanical? Are they just bad pilots? It boiled down to they think that the cockpit was designed poorly even though it was made for an average person. Whether that meant like the seat was too far away from the pedals or the steering wheel or all the things that they had to control. So they did a study of 4,063 pilots where they measured 140 different dimensions of their body: leg length, chest width, shoulders, and length of their arms, and all these different things to see if the cockpit was maybe the reason that all these people were having crashes. It turns out if you took the average of 10 different dimensions, say height, weight, length of their arms, not a single person was average in all of the categories. So because of that, if you design for an average person, you're actually designing for no one. So then they decided to make adjustable seats and all these things to adjust to fit for like if you're between the 5 and 95% of a bell curve. Similarly, there was a study where someone took an fMRI scan where they see different parts of your brain that light up with different activity, and they did a memory test of all these different people to see what parts of their brain they were using to create memories. And they made like this aggregate picture of all of the different scans. But then when they went back and looked at all the different people individually, none of them really looked like the aggregate scan of what the average was. So then he goes on to talk about why do we use averages. Back in 1819, a guy named Adolphe Quetelet, he was an astronomer in Belgium. He didn't have any access to an observatory because of like political upheaval at the time. So he decided to take his training in science and astronomy and try to apply it to society as a whole. And in astronomy, they would take their telescope and they would look at like Saturn is right here, and over a certain amount of time, it would go right here. So this is how fast it's moving, but every astronomer would have a slightly different measurement. So they would average them to come up with what they thought was maybe the most accurate thing. He applied these principles to people and similarly did a bunch of measurements of dimensions of people. He called this the Quetelet Index, and also came up with BMI, which we still use all the time today. Then he went a little bit further and started using averages of like, what is the average rate of poverty, or what is the average rate of suicide or divorce rate, and all these things. People always thought these are so individualized, there's no way you could come up with an average, but it turns out there was an average rate for these things. He got a little carried away and said that anything that is a deviance from the average is like a disease basically, and you all should try to strive to be the average thing. Some of these principles are what Karl Marx used to develop his theories of communism. He also helped Abraham Lincoln with the troops in the United States for figuring out what sizes of uniforms that they should make. Also, back when there were a lot of cholera outbreaks, Dr. John Snow used these principles to figure out where the outbreaks were occurring and kind of led to what we know of public health today. Later in 1851, at the First World Fair, one of his understudies named Francis Galton, some of the averages that Quetelet realized were falling behind in Britain compared to the United States. And he was like, why is this country falling behind compared to this other one? And he thought that not only does society need to try and improve the average, but also people might fit into different categories. If you look at like a bell curve, he divided the bell curve up into 14 different classes, the lowest being the imbeciles, the middle being the mediocre, and the upper class was called the eminent. He thought if you were in one of these categories, you are more likely to also be good at other things. Like if you're really good at sports, you're more likely to be beautiful and also intelligent, so people should be broken up into different classes. Next, in 1856, we have this guy, Frederick Winslow Taylor, who worked at a factory and kind of worked his way up to be the head engineer guy. And he saw a lot of inefficiency in the workers because there was a high turnover rate, and people would kind of try to come up with their own way of doing things that didn't always work out. So he looked at people that were really good at their job, like the person who was shoveling coal the best was scooping like 21 pounds per scoop. So he decided everyone needs to do exactly that. He said that businesses need managers to help set these standards or averages, and everyone needs to work to do exactly that instead of kind of individually coming up with your own way of doing things. He came out with a book in 1911 called The Methods of Scientific Management. This led to a whole movement of Taylorism, or being Tayloristic. And a lot of companies are still kind of run like this, where they come up with a standard operating procedure, and then you're supposed to perform exactly like that instead of coming up with your own way of doing things. On a side note, it turns out that Lenin and Stalin really liked this guy for reasons you can probably understand. Applying this to a school system, you had two different camps, the Taylorists and the Humanists. The Taylorists would say that you should come up with a curriculum that gives an average education to an average person so that they can all become workers that don't have any individualistic properties. The Humanists would say that you should give a ton of resources to every student, and then they can kind of craft their own thing and come up with their own way of doing things. Our school systems are mostly more Tayloristic now, and then the managers are like the superintendents and the principals who come up with the curriculum. He was very big on the people who are working in a factory or students shouldn't come up with the curriculum. The people who aren't doing it should look at the people below them and figure out what should be done. In 1900, we had this guy named Edward Thorndike. He mostly agreed with those principles, but also said that you're going to come up with like superior students and inferior students, and we should decrease the resources to the people who aren't doing well and spend them on the people who are doing well so that they can become managers and superintendents or whatever. He also was big on creating standardized tests and college entrance exams and comparing people based on the average to figure out which of these classes you're going to fit into. Then we have this guy named Peter Molinar, and he looked at these systems and kind of thought that everything was all flip-flopped. Instead of taking a bunch of data about a big group and then applying it to an individual, we should be taking a bunch of individuals and learning their habits and then apply that to the group. He called this the ergodic switch. This comes also from the fact that you can't really study one gas particle. You have to study a volume of gas and then apply those principles to a single particle. But then if you look at how physics is explaining this, this only applies to an ergodic system where all the particles are the same now and will be in the future. Obviously humans are not like this because we're all a little bit different. So Peter Molinar would say that we should make everything a little bit more individualistic. It's just that this is really difficult and it requires a lot more data. The second part of the book is called Principles of Individuality, and he talks about how Google was hiring people just on their grades and their SAT scores, and it turns out that they were getting not a great group, and it was a little homogenized and not really branching off and being as creative as they wanted. He then talks about the jagged principle. The thing that you're measuring is probably more complicated than it seems to be with a single number, such as like how big is someone. You might have someone who's really tall and someone who's really wide. Which one is bigger? Well, one is taller and one is wider, so it's kind of hard to say to rank people based on size. So ranking people just on one number usually doesn't work all that well. Then they use this great example of the New York Knicks. For a while they were only taking people on their team who had the highest points per game, because obviously more points leads to winning more basketball games. I don't know, I'm not really much of a sports person. But their team was horrible. It turns out that you need variation, like you need someone who's really good at assists, one person who's good at stealing the ball, someone who's fast. So when the coach that started doing that left, their team did way better. So when Google figured this out, they started looking at employees based on like 400 different characteristics that they might have, including have you ever been in a band? Where have you traveled? You know, all these things that aren't just like an SAT score. And it turns out that there wasn't a single thing in all of these 400 metrics that had a high correlation with how good they are going to be at their job. So the book is really arguing you shouldn't be looking at grades and scores, you should be looking at how is this person going to function and what are they going to individually bring to the overall group to make it better. Then he talks about traits like are you introverted or extroverted is kind of a myth. We have all these things like a Myers-Briggs indicator or even horoscopes that put you into a box of how you might act in certain situations. But it turns out a single individual trait doesn't really correlate well with what your other traits are going to be. There's a book called Persons in Context by Yuichi Shota, and it says maybe you're extroverted when you're at work, maybe you're more introverted when you're with your friends, maybe you're more introverted when you're stressed out. So just saying that you're introverted or extroverted doesn't really explain the whole picture without any context. Then you apply this to like aggression or stealing or cheating or humility or empathy and all these different things. We probably all possess these, but to a different degree and in a different context. Maybe someone would be caught cheating on a test in like high school because they're like, oh, it's just a test in high school, whereas they would never actually do that if they were working in the field. So the best way to actually judge if someone's gonna be a good employee is by seeing them in the context of what they're doing. The next section is called We All Walk the Road Less Traveled. And here we looked at infant development and how going from laying to rolling to crawling to walking has traditionally been looked at. These are the steps that you go through, but Karen Adolph, who studies childhood development, looked very, very closely at 28 individuals and thought that there were like 25 different pathways that everyone went through. All of them led to walking, but people might go from one thing to another or revert a little bit. Everyone's a little bit different. This was also realized by Arnold Gazelle, who was a pediatrician, who came up with these milestones of this is when you do this, at 18 months you do this, at 2 years you do this, but it ends up being pretty variable and most people still have a good outcome. Benjamin Bloom looked at different education models where you might have people who have a rigid time frame to learn a certain concept, like in traditional schools. He had a different classroom of kids who had the same amount of time teaching per day. If something was coming easily to you, you could breeze past it a little bit, and if you're having a hard time with a subject, you could stay on it a little bit. Everyone did well with that model, and it's just harder to do. It resonated with me quite a bit because until 5th grade I was homeschooled, where if I didn't understand something in math, we wouldn't move on to the next topic. But if there was something that I understood right away, I could just kind of go past it. In the end, I could have a lot less school per day because I would only be on the topic as long as I needed to. This is really hard to scale up, but it's been done really well, especially with online stuff, like through Khan Academy, which is amazing, by the way, and I watch all the time even though I'm not in school anymore. The third part of the book is called The Age of Individuals. It looks at a couple different companies, one of which was Costco. You kind of get to make your own path of what you want to do eventually, whether that be a manager or in sales or whatever. And getting to that next position doesn't mean you need to have a certain diploma or a master's in business administration or a certain GPA. It's more based on your passion for wanting to become that thing. He then talks about replacing averages in the education system. Hey, it's the next day and I'm editing the video, realizing that the last third or so didn't get recorded. I'm not feeling ambitious enough to re-record it, so you might just have to go read the book yourself. The last third is dealing with applying all of the stuff to education and the workplace. Overall, he kind of says that instead of having a diploma, things should be more credential based at how good you are at the thing, and that should be determined by people who are in the industry instead of like your principal or the head of your college. And also, instead of the people who are higher up than you telling you what to do, there should be a little bit more individualistic freedom so that you can kind of make your own path to success. There's a lot that I left out in this video. It was a great read and I really recommend checking out the whole thing. I left a link in the description. I'm hoping to do more videos like this where I read a book and just kind of summarize it. It kind of benefits me and hopefully benefits you as well. Let me know if you liked it. Let me know if there's something you'd like changed.